Hi, Liz here, and we are at EMO's Creative Studio, where anything you create is beautiful because you created it. So today we're going to be talking about a process called piecing. Now, if you go to the internet and look up under Google or any other search engine or the dictionary, it'll tell you that piecing is putting two items together. In the quilting world, there is two definitions. Piecing can be putting two pieces of fabric together to make it a block or a unit, or putting two units together to make part of a block. So for our purposes, I'm going to show you how to piece using two pieces of fabric. So let's get started. So I'm going to show you how to make a very simple and basic block. I'm using two different types of fabric or two different types of print to make this very simple block. This particular piece of fabric is 6 inches by 9 inches. I've already cut it and it is squared off and it is not stretched out of shape. It's in perfect condition. I pressed it by moving up and down my iron instead of dragging it across. I have two pieces of fabric that are 2 inches up and down, or this way, by 9 inches across, and another two pieces of fabric that are 2 inches by 9.5 inches across. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the two shorter pieces of fabric, one on the bottom and one on top, to make the beginning of my block. I'm going to put right sides together. That means the bright part of the fabric. You can see here there's a nice beautiful colored fabric, and if you turn it over, it is kind of dull and you can't really see the pattern. When the fabric is at the manufacturer, there's two ways they could put a pattern on the fabric. They can print it like this one is, and you can tell because one side is nice and bright and the other side is kind of dull and opaque, or they can weave the pattern in, and that means each thread is colored to weave that pattern to make the pattern. I unfortunately do not have any fabric at this time available to me to show you what a woven print in the fabric is. So again, we're going to put right sides, which is the pretty side or the brilliant side, together, matching up the edges. And in the quilting world, the standard seam allowance, which means the measurement from the edge of the fabric to where your thread is 1/4 of an inch. Now, I have two different types of items that I can use to make sure that when I put this under my sewing machine, I want it to stay together and not move around like this while I'm sewing it, because I want to make sure that my sewing seam allowance is precise at 1/4 of an inch, because if the seam allowance is not precise, then your finished block, which this will be once everything is pieced together, will not be the size that you're looking for. So again, there's two ways that we can do it. We can place pins into the fabric. Sorry, that's Baxter. Sorry. And we can keep our pieces of fabric together like this, or we can use clips, quilting clips. I prefer the quilting clips because I find when I use pins, it distorts my fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and I am going to clip my fabric pieces together so that they are very nicely sewn. So now that I have my two pieces of fabric that are right sides together with wrong sides facing me, they are pinned or clipped together. Now I'm ready to go to the machine. So let me go to the machine. Now we're at the machine. I have a walking foot attached to my machine, and what a walking foot does, it moves the top fabric and the bottom fabric at the same time so that they're not coming apart. I prefer to use a walking foot. Most machines, some of the more expensive machines come with walking feet, but I'm sure that if you want to invest in a walking foot, you could find one that's reasonably priced and you can add it onto your machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this under the walking foot, and my walking foot measures out to 1/4 of an inch. So the edge of the fabric right here is going to be following the edge of my walking foot. Again, the edge of my fabric right here is going to follow the edge of my fabric, and I want to be precise. So even though this is a professional machine and I can go 1,500 stitches a minute, I'm not going to do that because I want a precise 1/4 of an inch. For me personally, the faster I sew, the more out of line my stitching is going to be. I am not going to backstitch at the beginning or the end of my stitching. I don't need to, because when I connect the other pieces of fabric onto the center square, it will lock off my stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and start sewing very slowly, and I want to pay attention to what I'm sewing, making sure that I keep this edge of the fabric to the edge of the foot so I can have a precise 1/4 of an inch. Another reason why I like these clips is because they're easy to take out. Pins, I end up poking myself when I pull the pins out. So you can see I am sewing exactly at 1/4 of an inch. As you can see right here, I now have a nice 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Again, the 1/4 of an inch is from the edge of the fabric to where you see the thread right here. That is 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to go to my machine and I am going to press open my seam. I'm going to put, well, you know what? Let's go to the sewing, to the ironing board, and let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to do something called set the seam. And what I'm doing is I'm warming up the fibers of the fabric so that when I fold it to, when I open up the seam, or when I open up the fabric like this, I'm going to have a very nice creased, a nice crease when I iron it open. I'm going to be ironing to the dark side of the fabric, which means I'm both, instead of opening up my seam and spreading it one side and the other side, I'm going to press to the dark side. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the seam. And what I do is I place my iron right on top of the fabric. Bring it out so you can see it better. And I'm going to warm up the threads. Now remember, this is a hot iron, so be careful when you're finger pressing your fabric open. And I'm pressing to the dark side. So I want my seam allowance to be what I would consider this is my dark fabric. Now I'm going to place my iron onto the fabric. A quick shot of steam. A quick shot of steam. Let it cool off a little bit before I move it, because I don't want anything to stretch. Let me turn it over to the back side, and you see that the seam is facing in the direction of the dark side of the fabric. I've pressed to the dark side of the fabric. So now I have pieced together 2 pieces of fabric, and now I have a unit. This is another word that we use in quilting. Now I want to attach the second, or the bottom part of my block here. Again, I'm going to either pin or use clips so that I'm making sure that my fabric doesn't move when I'm sewing it. Right there and right there. I'm going to go ahead to the machine, sew this up real quick, and I'll meet you right back here at the ironing board. I want to show you an oops that I just did, because I looked away for a brief second, my fabric folded underneath, and now I've got this crease or folded area. You don't want to leave it that way because 1, your edges are not matching right here. 2, it's going to show a funky little fold. So I'm going to pull out my friend, Mr. Ripper. Every quilter loves this, Mr. Ripper. This is a seam ripper, very inexpensive. And I'm just going to cut it right here, and I'm going to pull out the seam or the thread right here. Let's show you right here, and of course right here. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put this in the machine again. I did not rip the seam all the way across, so I'm going to put this in the machine again, and I'm going to sew from the edge, and I'm going to sew on top of this thread right here. This is going to save me a little bit of not ripping out the entire seam. So I'll be right back. Okay, now we're back at the ironing board, and you can see that I've sewn and fixed that little rumple I have there. We're going to set the seam just by putting the iron on top, finger press it open, and then we are setting the seam and ironing to the dark side. Just gently don't iron like you're sawing back and forth, minimal movement. I like to make sure my fabric is cooled off, and gee, as you can see here, I didn't do such a good job of pinning because I'm way off over here, and if you look at this side, I'm way off. So I am going to I'm going to iron this open, and I'm going to pull out all the thread all the way across and redo this. So I'll come right back to you. I'm going to take my other piece of fabric right here, and I'm going to put them right sides together. I'm going to pin it across or clip it across, whatever you choose to use. And I'm going to again sew with my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Let me go ahead and do pin. And let me go ahead and take it to the machine, and I'll come back and show you what it looks like. And I have it sewn in place. I'm going to take my iron, I'm going to set the seam. Then I'm going to iron to the seam to the dark side, trying not to squiggle my iron around. And now I've got 3 sides of my block completed. Let me take this other piece, pin it on, sew it, and let me show you what this block looks like once it is completed. Now we're at the cutting mat. As you can see, and let me see if I could show you really quickly. As you can see, I don't have an even piece of, or even block right here. It's a little off. I wasn't quite precise cutting, and it's a little off down here, so I want to square up my block And I'm going to just pan out a little. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of these lines and I'm going to measure one of these black lines to the sewing edge right here. What I'm looking for over here is to make sure the shortest end is right at the edge of my ruler, and I'm going to cut off anything that's excess. Again, I'm going to put 3 fingers on the ruler. Try to keep them about an inch away from your rotary cutter, and the other 2 fingers are on the mat and or fabric. I'm going to open up my cutting blade. Oops, did you see that? Because I wasn't looking. And now I've cut the excess off, and now I have a perfectly straight edge here. This is just the edge of the fabric. I already know that this is straight, and now I'm going to turn it around, and I want to do the same thing to this side. I also want to cut off these extra strings that are here. Again, I am going to look for a black line that I'm going to place on top of the seam. I'm going to look to make sure that I am not going to be whacking off a big amount of fabric. It should be just a little, 3 or 4 or 5 threads that come off. Again, I'm going to slide my rotary cutter against my ruler, and you see I've taken off the uneven edges. Close my rotary cutter, and now my block is squared up, and I can use this to make part of my quilt, or I can make a miniature table topper for a little table. This could be a part of a table runner. It can be anything that you want. This is a very simple and easy block to make. If you wanted to, if this is your first time making a quilt, and you want to make a baby quilt for someone, even though these are not really colors that I would use for a baby quilt, you can add on more pieces of border, which this is called, and widen out your baby blanket. It could be a lap baby blanket, it could be a burping blanket, it could be whatever you want it to be, because you're the one that's creating your project. I want to show you another way of piecing. This is going to be a 9-patch block. And why is it called 9 patches? Because you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 squares that you will have sewn together. I will show you in another video how to get these 3 pieces together using a 2.5 by width of fabric strip of fabric. I am going to quickly piece these 3 units. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to quickly piece these 3 units together to create a 9-patch block like this. So, as I've told you, I ironed my seams to the dark side, and in this particular case, my print I'm using as the dark side. So you can see my seam allowances are pressed out on this top one, and the center one, my seam allowances are ironed or pressed to the inside, which is the print, and this bottom one, my seam allowances are pressed to the outside. Why is it that way? Because it's going to be easier for me to nest my seams so that I can get a perfect measured seam point, if that makes any sense. So I'm nesting my seams, and that should happen automatically. I am not one to use pins. I know I've said this before because I find that it distorts, but in this case, because I need to match up these seams perfectly, I'm going to have to use a pin. So I place the pin in the center of the thread of the seam allowance, and I want to make sure that it comes out right on the thread on the other side. Can you see this right here? I placed my pin into the thread right here, and if I look on the other side, it came out on the thread. Again, on this seam allowance, I'm going to nest my seams, or hook them together, nest them together, and I'm going to grab another pin, place my pin into the stitched area, turn it to the other side, and it's pretty much the same. When it comes out like that, it almost guarantees that you're going to have a perfect matching 4-point. In this, it's more than 2 4-points. So let me go ahead and sew this and then come back and show you what it looks like. Alright, I've sewn it. Now let's open it and see. It's almost a perfect 4-corner. Let me show you right here. See, nesting the seams allows it to match perfectly the points. And this is off by a thread, but it's pretty good. Now I'm going to go ahead, while I got you on here, I'm going to set the seam, and then I'm going to open it up, and I know I'm not showing it to you. And now I've ironed it really nice. And now I've got 6 squares that have been sewn together. Now I need to add the last set. And again, I'm going to nest the seams to make sure that I get a perfect 4-point at both intersections. And I do have a video that I did last year, and you can look it up. And it shows you in more detail how to get a perfect 4-point seam. And I go over it using the 1/4-inch seam allowance, and then I go over it using a 1/2-inch seam allowance so that you can see it a little bit better. So you could go ahead and take a look at it, and you can find it in my listing. I've got this pinned together, so let me go ahead and sew it and show you what it looks like once it's sewn. Alright, it's now sewn. It's got the perfect 4-point seam, and it's going to even look better once I press it. I set the seam, you can hear me doing it, and I'm going to press to the inside so that my seams are running the same way. So when I attach this onto the next item, I'm going to be fine. So there is a 9 patch that I've done for you. I've pieced 3 units. This is a unit, this is a unit, and this is a unit. I pieced it together. You can turn this around in any direction and it looks the same. The name of this particular block is called a 9 patch. So I hope that this tutorial was easy for you to understand. If you have any questions, comments, please comment below. Like, subscribe, share. Come see me on Facebook at EMO's Liz. My email address is below. Happy quilting. Until the next time, this is Liz, and we are at EMO's Creative Studio, where anything you create is beautiful because you created it. Take care. Bye.